It was generally agreed in the county that Lady Whitcombe had very good taste in wine and very bad taste in relatives. The first was borne out that October evening by the admirable Whodunit Port, marching solemnly round the long mahogany table like a bishop in red stockings. The second was represented, somewhat more noisily, by the collection of Whitcombes, Chattertons, and allied hangers-on who composed the house party at Whitcombe Hall. "I don't in the least mind murder, you know," observed Lord Peter Wimsey dreamily to his hostess, "but I refuse to drink anything labelled clarity with 2 T's. That is carrying barbarism too far." Lady Whitcombe, whose diamonds trembled when she laughed, glanced anxiously at the bottle the butler was presenting at the lower end of the table.
"My dear Lord Peter, surely not. Meredith would never..." "Quite right, Aunt Edith," drawled a tall, dark young man at Wimsey's left. "Mere spelling is beneath the dignity of the Whitcombe butler." Lord Peter turned an attentive monocle upon his neighbour. "Then Mr. Meredith must have a colleague in crime, Mr.
Chatterton, isn't it? Because the cellar book in the library shelters a truly diabolical orthography. And if there is anything more alarming than a misspelt claret, it is the person who misspells it." The dark young man, Guy Chatterton, Lady Whitcombe's nephew by marriage and, rumour said, by necessity, smiled with a hint of contempt.
"You detectives see mysteries everywhere, Lord Peter." "Not everywhere," said Wimsey mildly. "Only in houses where the wine is good enough to be worth poisoning."
It was the sort of remark that in London would have produced applause, and in Mayfair, possibly an experiment. But in the dining-room of Whitcombe Hall, it earned only a thin titter from Lady Whitcombe's companion, Miss Lydia Marsh, and a scandalised cough from the vicar. There is something about a long, polished table, heavy silver and family portraits that renders the English mind morally indignant at any open allusion to violent death. "Really, Lord Peter," protested Lady Whitcombe, "you will frighten poor Mr. Merivale. He has already confessed to me that the country by candlelight makes him think of ghosts." The gentleman indicated, a pale, fastidious barrister with a reputation for cross-examination and neuralgia, smiled without enthusiasm. "Not ghosts, Lady Whitcombe, merely unpaid bills and disappointed beneficiaries." "A very modern form of haunting," said Wimsey, "more terrifying because more litigious." At the far end of the table, opposite Lady Whitcombe, Sir Julian Whitcombe raised his glass with the slow solemnity of a man who felt that port ought to be reverenced, even if one's liver had independent views on the subject. The candles made a yellow island about his bald head and heavy, sagging face. His evening coat sat on him like a sentence of imprisonment. "I will ask you all," he said, to drink a toast. "To Whitcombe," he paused, breath whistling faintly, "and to the continuance of the family name and estates." It was not, as toasts go, particularly original, but there ran round the table a small perceptible stir, like the ripple from a stone dropped into shallow water. Miss Marsh's thin hand tightened on her wineglass. Mr. Chatterton's dark eyes flickered. Somewhere behind Wimsey's back, a spoon clinked prematurely against china, and the sound was quickly smothered. "To Whitcombe," murmured the guests. Sir Julian drank deeply. Perhaps too deeply, Wimsey thought, for a gentleman whose doctor, Metcalfe of Harley Street, if memory served, had spoken with feeling of blood pressure and temperance. There was something almost theatrical in the old man's gesture, in the way his heavy lids drooped, then struggled up once more as he set the glass down with a little thud. It was then that the clock in the hall outside began to strike 10. The sound came muffled through the thick oak door. 1, 2, 3, measured, deliberate, dispassionate, as though time itself were calling evidence. On the 7th stroke, Sir Julian's hand jerked oddly on the tablecloth. By the 9th, his mouth had twisted into a curious, grotesque grimace. On the 10th, the final echo died away, and Sir Julian Whitcombe, Baronet, Master of Whitcombe Hall, pitched forward across the shining mahogany, his empty glass spinning slowly from his fingers. For a second, no one moved. It was as if the whole company had been turned to to wax figures. Then Lady Whitcombe gave a small, very ladylike scream. Miss Marsh dropped her napkin, and the vicar rose with an incoherent exclamation about air. Lord Peter, whose attention at that precise instant had been fixed not on Sir Julian, but on the pattern of dust on the heavy red damask curtains behind him, pushed back his chair with infuriating leisureliness. "Dear me," he said, "that is the worst of these hereditary estates. One never knows when they will come to a full stop." Nobody moved at first. The fire in the great stone fireplace gave a little sputter, as though shocked into discretion, and then settled to a dull, watchful glow. Somewhere in the panelling the old house creaked, politely declining to be surprised. Captain Marston was the first to break the paralysis. He lurched to his feet, knocking his chair over, and stared at his aunt's fallen head, the flushed face already slackening.
"Good God," he said, with the uninventiveness of genuine horror. Miss Penrose did not rise.
Her hands were tightly folded on the damask, and her lips moved once, soundlessly, like a woman reciting a familiar prayer and discovering that the words had deserted her. The Reverend Mr. Blackwood clasped his fingers together on the tablecloth in a fashion that might have been devotion or merely a determined effort not to faint onto the cutlery. "Don't let's all do something desperate," murmured Whimsy. He had not moved, save that his monocle had slipped and been negligently caught again. "Dr.
Thornhill, you are quite certain?"
The doctor bent once more over Lady Whitcombe, performing those brief, fussy manipulations that seemed designed rather to reassure the living than assist the dead. Presently he straightened, tugged at his cuffs, and shook his head. "Quite certain," he said. "There is nothing to be done." "On the contrary," said Whimsy gently, "there is a most uncomfortable amount to be done. Only, alas, none of it will be by you." Lady Whitcombe's butler, Refford, had appeared in the doorway with the noiseless inevitability of a doom in a Greek tragedy. His funereal gaze travelled over the scene, the overturned chair, the scattered dessert forks, the champagne staining the cloth. "You rang, my lady?" he inquired, in the tone of one prepared to be disappointed. "No, Refford," said Whimsy before the others had quite found their voices. "But perhaps you would be so good as to telephone for the police. Superintendent Pumfret, at Morecambe. Lady Whitcombe has died suddenly at dinner, and I should be vastly obliged by his immediate attention." Refford directed a slow, cavernous stare at Whimsy, as though measuring the propriety of taking orders from a guest. "Very good, my lord," he said at last, and withdrew, closing the door behind him with ecclesiastical decorum. "It may be nothing more than the heart," muttered Thornhill, his fingers fumbling awkwardly at the pearls about Lady Whitcombe's throat before thinking better of it. "She has been under considerable strain. The estate, family anxieties, these things will tell." "Possibly," assented Whimsy. "But since we have summoned the law, we should, I think, leave them as little as possible to exercise their imagination upon. Captain Marston, pray do not touch that glass." Marston, who had instinctively stooped to retrieve the fallen crystal, straightened as though jerked by a string. "You think—" he began hoarsely. "I think nothing at all," said Whimsy cheerfully. "Thinking before coffee is a vice to which I have not yet descended. I merely remark that robust ladies of her ladyship's age do not commonly drop dead in the middle of a suggestive toast, immediately after drinking excellent champagne. It is the sort of coincidence which makes coroners edgy and superintendents officious. If you will all be so extremely kind as to remain exactly where you are, yes, even the pious, our friends from Morecambe, may be spared at least one picturesque misconception." Miss Penrose lifted her eyes at last from the table. "Must we sit here, like this, until they come?" she whispered. "Alas," said Whimsy, "we are all, for the moment, part of the arrangement. A still life, with social pretensions. Dr. Thornhill, you will indulge me by allowing Lady Whitcombe to remain precisely as she fell. The police, you know, have an affecting belief that the dead never lie." Thornhill hesitated, then spread his hands in resignation. "If you insist." But I tell you, Whimsy, the chances are it is all perfectly natural. My dear doctor, replied Lord Peter, with a faint, rueful smile, if there is one adjective which I should never, in a long and varied acquaintance, have dreamed of applying to—
Lady Whitcombe, it is natural. It was Miss Penrose who broke the silence, her voice brittle as spun glass. You speak as if this were some kind of mechanical problem, Lord Peter. A question of levers and stoppers. Lady Whitcombe is dead. Precisely, said Whimsy.
And since we cannot undo that lamentable fact, it becomes a question of sequence. Murder, Miss Penrose, is very largely a matter of sequence. Who did what, when, and in what precise order? Motive is merely the sentimental embroidery afterwards. Sir Julian stirred at last, passing a hand over his face as though wiping away a mask. If this is murder, he began unsteadily, and I can't quite bring myself to believe it, then the police ought to be sent for at once, telephone lines or no. Refford, you can send William to the village. He can take the car. The car, Sir Julian, Refford interrupted with glacial respect, is at present in the lower drive, my lady having directed Perkins to leave it there in case of flooding near the main entrance. The water in the south meadow was already rising at 8 o'clock. I doubt it is passable now. How very like England, murmured Whimsy. One can commit murder with exquisite modern efficiency and still be foiled by an honest field of mud. Let us be accurate, Sir Julian. It is now— He consulted his watch. 10 minutes past 10. Dinner was announced at 8. The telephone wires were down at 7:30. Your wife was poisoned sometime between 7 and 9, depending on whether we consider opportunity or effect. The nearest assistance is 2 miles away, across what appears to be rapidly developing swamp. We are, in short, thrown back upon the primitive resources of human observation. Captain Marston, who had been pacing in jerky, uneven strides, swung round suddenly. Are we to be detained here like suspects in a cheap detective story? My dear Captain, said Whimsy gently, we are suspects in an expensive one. The Whitcombes don't do things by halves. For the moment, however, I must trouble you for the exact sequence of events since 7 o'clock. Dr. Thornhill, perhaps you will begin. You arrived— when? At 6:30, the doctor replied, still glancing uneasily at Lady Whitcomb's body. Lady Whitcombe had asked me to look in on Sir Julian, purely routine. I found his blood pressure satisfactory. I left him in his dressing room at 6:45 and went down to the library. Alone? Certainly alone. I remained there until Refford announced dinner. In the library, repeated Whimsy, within reach of the telephone, which, we are assured, was already defunct. Did you attempt to use it? No. Why should I? Indeed, why should you? Whimsy's voice was mild. Miss Penrose, you adjusted the place cards at what time exactly? 10 minutes to 8, she answered after a moment's thought. I remember because the gong hadn't gone yet, and I was anxious that her ladyship shouldn't see me moving things about. And you touched what precisely? The cards. Only the cards. Not the glasses, the decanter, the stopper? No. Bunter, still hovering near the sideboard, spoke in his quiet, impersonal way. If I might mention, my lord, the rim of her ladyship's glass shows slight crystalline residue, distinguishable from dried wine. The other glasses do not. Thank you, Bunter. The mechanics grow ever clearer. Whimsy's gaze travelled slowly around the table, resting for a fraction longer than was comfortable on each face in turn. Captain Marston? I came down at 5 minutes to 8, said the captain, too quickly. Had a whisky in the drawing room. Geoffrey, that is, Perkins, poured it. We went into dinner when the gong sounded. I never went near the sideboard. Why should I? The cry of innocence, observed Whimsy, is always marked by that same rhetorical question. Still, we are not yet at the stage of apportioning virtue and vice, merely of constructing a reliable timetable. Outside, the wind rose to a shrill, almost human wail, and somewhere in the distance a branch crashed, dragging against the roof with a sound like fingernails upon wood. The house seemed to draw in upon itself, the great dining room shrinking to the tight circle of candlelight around the table and the motionless figure of Lady Whitcombe, who, in death as in life, remained the undeniable centre of attention. "We shall," said Whimsy quietly, "remove ourselves to the drawing-room. The servants will remain available, but no one leaves the house, and no one—" His gaze sharpened. "No one goes near the cellars. Until the police arrive, Whitcombe Hall is, as the novelists say, a closed world. Let us see what its inhabitants choose to reveal." For a moment no one answered. The question seemed to hang in the candlelit air with the same stubborn persistence as the smell of spilt champagne, and something sharper, more acrid beneath it. It was Dr. Thornhill who spoke first, his tone brisk with professional impatience. "This is unproductive, Lord Peter, raking over old scandals when there has been a sudden death." "A murder," corrected Whimsy gently. "Do use the proper technical vocabulary, Doctor. Precision is so important in both medicine and crime." He regarded Thornhill with amiable curiosity. "You imply, by your eagerness to avoid the subject, that Lady Whitcombe possessed some particularly diverting information about yourself. Might one inquire what that was?" Thornhill flushed a dull, unbecoming red. "She knew nothing that could possibly be of interest to you. I have attended the family for 20 years. Our relationship was strictly professional." "Rarely a phrase to set the pulses racing," observed Whimsy, "but one must make do." His gaze shifted to Captain Marston, who stood by the fireplace, staring into the unlit grate as though expecting revelation from cold ashes. "And you, Captain, your aunt appeared to take an interest in your movements this evening. I noticed she asked several questions about your trip to London last week." Marston started slightly. "She asked when I returned. I told her. There was nothing more to it." "Indeed, I have found that when women of Lady Whitcombe's temperament ask when, they are generally more interested in where and with whom. But perhaps I'm maligning her." He turned a little in his chair. "Miss Penrose, how long have you been companion to the late lady?" 22 years, said Miss Penrose, with the air of one reciting a sentence. "I entered her service when I was 23. An interesting verb, entered her service. One might almost suppose a religious vocation." Whimsy rolled the stem of his wine-glass delicately between thumb and forefinger. "Were you content in that cloister?" Her thin lips compressed. "Lady Whitcombe gave me a home when I had nowhere else to go. I was grateful." "Ah, yes," murmured Whimsy. "Gratitude. A remarkably durable emotion until it isn't." His eyes travelled slowly round the table. "Suppose we descend from the loftier heights of motive to the somewhat more pedestrian field of opportunity. The chronology, if you please." He addressed Refford, who managed, despite the circumstances, to look as though he disapproved of clocks on principle. "You brought the champagne up at 8:15 precisely, my lord. I decanted it here. The dinner gong sounded at 8:30. "And during that quarter hour between decanting and dinner, who was in this room?" "Only myself and William, my lord." Later, as I mentioned, Miss Penrose stepped in to adjust the place cards. "Not I alone," said Miss Penrose quickly. "Lady Whitcombe came in with me. She wished to ensure that Captain Marston was not seated next to Mrs. Chudley." "There is no Mrs. Chudley present," remarked the Reverend, startled into exactness. "Precisely," said Miss Penrose. "Her carriage never arrived. The roads, you know." "Most interesting," said Whimsy. "So Lady Whitcombe anticipated a guest who failed to materialize, necessitating a last-minute revision of the table of precedence. That would account for your concern, Miss Penrose. Bunter, what do you make of the stopper?" Bunter, who had been hovering with self-effacing vigilance near the sideboard, stepped forward, holding a folded napkin with the reverence appropriate to a holy relic. "There are minute crystalline traces adhering to the lower surface, my lord, near the bevel, and a faint discoloration around the rim. Also a slight roughening as though recently abraded." "Meaning," translated Whimsy for the company, that someone introduced a small quantity of crystalline prussic compound to the stopper, where it would dissolve gradually into the film of wine clinging to the glass. Heavy enough to sink, light enough to cling. Chemistry was never wasted on me, you perceive. Marston made an impatient gesture. But if that's the case, any of us might have received the poison. Not quite, said Whimsy. Observe the mechanics. Refford, when you poured, did you lift the decanter by the neck or by the body? By the body, my lord, Refford replied, stiff with dignity. Always by the body, with the thumb steadying the shoulder. Exactly. And when you refilled Lady Whitcomb's glass after the toast? I had just replaced the stopper, my lord. Her ladyship complained that her glass was not full enough. I removed the stopper and poured again. And held it by the neck that time, completed Whimsy, almost kindly. The natural way when one is making a small adjustment rather than a formal service. In so doing, your fingers would have pressed the poisoned residue on the stopper against the lip of the decanter, sending the concentrated film into the immediate pour. Lady Whitcombe, and Lady Whitcombe alone, would receive the fatal dose. Miss Penrose gave a soft, involuntary cry. Sir Julian closed his eyes. An elegant little device, mused Whimsy, efficient, selective, and dependent upon an intimate knowledge of Refford's professional habits. Our murderer, it seems, understands both chemistry and butlers. One wonders which is the more alarming. 4 heads turned simultaneously toward the great bracket clock on the wall, its gilded pendulum swinging with an air of injured rectitude, as though it resented being dragged into sordid human affairs. The painted moon phase stared blandly back at them, somewhere between gibbous and complicit. You are mistaken, Lord Peter, said Sir Julian, with a touch of desperation. The clock has been unreliable for years. It loses, it gains, one never knows quite where one is with it. How like society, murmured Whimsy. Nevertheless, when I entered the dining room, I had occasion to consult it. Refford had just finished decanting the champagne, and I remember noting the time, 8:15 precisely. Yet Lady Whitcombe rose to give her toast when the clock struck 9, and unless my digestion has become remarkably accelerated, we did not sit over the fish course for 3/4 of an hour. Refford bowed stiffly. His lordship is correct about the earlier time. I heard it myself when I came in with the soup. The clock chimed the quarter. And who, pray, asked Whimsy, is entrusted with the sacred responsibility of winding and regulating this notoriously unreliable chronometer? That would be me, said Dr. Thornhill unexpectedly. Lady Whitcombe insisted. She said she didn't trust the servants with anything delicate. I wind it every Thursday and adjust it when necessary. How very intimate, observed Whimsy. You keep her heart beating and her hours correct. A dual responsibility of no little psychological significance. He wandered toward the clock, studying it as one might inspect a suspect manuscript. You adjusted it during dinner this evening. Thornhill's eyes flickered. Nonsense.
Why on earth would I do such a thing?
Because, replied Whimsy pleasantly, you were out of the room for exactly 4 minutes between the fish and the entree, during which time Lady Whitcombe complained of a headache, and you insisted on fetching her your own special sal volatile from the hall cabinet. While you were there, you passed within 2 feet of this clock.
Refford, you remained in the dining room. Yes, my lord, I was supervising William with the dishes. And no one else left the table? There was a general murmur of denial.
Then if the clock was altered, Dr. Thornhill, you altered it. Whether consciously or with that remarkable absent-mindedness that afflicts physicians when their actions become inconvenient to explain, is another matter. Miss Penrose gave a small, strangled cry. You cannot truly suspect Dr. Thornhill. He has attended Lady Whitcombe for 20 years. Precisely, said Whimsy. An admirable opportunity to become familiar with such useful substances as prussic acid. So much more efficient than laudanum when one wishes to avoid tedious recoveries. Thornhill's lips compressed. Hydrocyanic acid is kept in my surgery for certain preparations, strictly under lock and key. And yet, mused Whimsy, who was called this afternoon to attend William in the pantry after his unfortunate encounter with the broken glass? You came up from the village,
Opened your bag in this very house and treated a minor cut with quite unnecessary ceremony.
A simple sticking plaster would have done, but instead you produced bottles and lint and a fine show of professional bustle. Where was your bag kept during that time? In the morning room, said Sir Julian automatically. I saw it there when I came in to speak with my wife at 5:30. Indeed, said Whimsy. So for at least an hour this house contained both the good doctor's unlocked medical bag and the decanter destined to hold the fatal champagne. A happy conjunction for someone with initiative. Captain Marston seized on this eagerly. Then it wasn't necessarily Thornhill. Anyone could have slipped the poison into the bag or taken it from there? Quite, agreed Whimsy. We have established opportunity in the plural. What interests me rather more is why someone found it necessary to tamper with the clock. Poisoning the champagne stopper could have been arranged at any point this afternoon, but falsifying the time suggests a particular anxiety about the precise moment of Lady Whitcombe's death. He glanced toward the door. Bunter, be so good as to reconnoitre the servants' quarters. I should like to know whether the kitchen clock agrees with its aristocratic cousin here. Bunter faded from the room with ghostly efficiency. Whimsy resumed his seat, steepling his fingers. Very well, he said. Until Inspector Grieve joins our little house party, let us continue our domestic archaeology. We have established that Lady Whitcombe was feared, resented, and perhaps hated by nearly everyone present. We know the method by which she was killed and have a preliminary sketch of opportunity. What we lack is the psychological hinge, the moment at which long-standing grievance hardened into irrevocable action. That, I fancy, will be found not in the surgery, nor the cellar, nor even in Refford's immaculate pantry, but in the private conversations that took place in this house between 6 and 8 o'clock this evening. His gaze moved slowly around the table. Let us, therefore, reconstruct those hours, carefully, truthfully, and in order. It is astonishing what small discrepancies may appear when one asks merely, where were you, and with whom? Since we appear committed to spending the night in one another's improving company, said Whimsy, drawing out his watch and consulting it with a frown, we may as well employ the time profitably. It is now, allowing for the Whitcombe Hall system of elastic chronology, approximately 20 minutes past 9. Lady Whitcombe died, by my reckoning, shortly after the clock finished striking the hour. Let us, therefore, reconstruct the evening with all the merciless precision of a coronation timetable. He resumed his seat with an air of patient determination. We shall begin, he continued, at 6 o'clock. Wreford, at what hour did you lay the table and bring up the champagne? The table was laid at 6:30, my lord, replied the butler, his voice steadier now that the conversation had drifted toward the familiar ground of routine. The champagne was brought up from the cellar at 7 precisely. I decanted it immediately, and the decanter remained here on the sideboard from that moment until dinner was announced. Yes, my lord. I left the room to assist with serving in the drawing-room at 7:10. William remained to finish polishing the glassware. William? Whimsy's gaze shifted toward the doorway as though expecting the footman to materialize by sheer force of interrogation. Williams is in the servants' hall, my lord, Refford supplied. Shall I fetch him? In due course. For the moment, let us confine ourselves to those present at this grotesque little charade. Whimsy's fingers tapped a soft, irregular rhythm on the table. Lady Whitcombe herself, where was she between 6 and dinner? Sir Julian answered with the automatic precision of habit. She received Mrs. Hartley at 5:30 in the morning room. I saw them together when I came in from the estate office shortly before 6. Eleanor left around 6:15. The storm had already begun. My wife then retired to her dressing room. I did not see her again until she came down to the drawing room at 7:45. Was she alone when she descended? Yes. Miss Penrose followed shortly afterwards. The companion nodded, her pale face earnest. Lady Whitcombe rang for me at 7:30. I helped fasten her necklace and arrange her hair. She seemed exhilarated. She said, "Tonight will settle everything, Agatha, one way or another." Then she sent me ahead to the drawing room while she checked the dinner table. "Ah yes, the pilgrimage to the altar of social correctness," murmured Whimsy. And during this sacred visitation, the decanter stood temptingly ready upon the sideboard, the stopper invitingly to hand. He turned to Dr. Thornhill. "And your own movements, Doctor, between 6 and the fatal toast?" "I left at 6:30, Thornhill replied, "after my consultation with Lady Whitcombe. I drove back to the surgery to see an emergency case, a farmhand with a crushed hand. I returned here at 10 minutes to 8, just as the gong sounded." "Alone?" "Naturally alone. I am not in the habit of transporting witnesses with me on professional calls." Whimsy smiled slightly. "The law, alas, is not always impressed by professional habits. The distance to your surgery? 2 miles by the lower road, perhaps 3 by the upper lane if the first is flooded. And yet you arrived precisely in time for dinner, despite the storm and your emergency case. Most commendable punctuality." Whimsy absorbed this with apparent indifference and turned instead to the rector. "Mr. Blackwood, your own itinerary." "I left the vicarage at 7:20, the clergyman answered promptly. "Arrived at 7:40 in the motor bicycle sidecar. I spoke briefly with Refford in the hall, removed my mackintosh, and joined the others in the drawing room. Lady Whitcombe was already there, speaking quietly with Sir Julian. Good. We begin to see the pattern of the dance." Whimsy rose again, restless energy driving him. "Bunter, you will oblige me by interviewing William and the kitchen staff, particularly as to who entered this room between 7 and 8. Obtain a list of comings and goings. Note any unusual errands, missing items, or unexplained absences. Also ascertain where the household keeps its cleaning materials, especially anything used for glass or metal." "Very good, my lord." Bunter withdrew with the quiet efficiency of a well-aimed thought. Whimsy turned back to the company. "One further detail troubles me. Sir Julian, you said Mrs. Paul Hartley left around 6:15 by the garden path?" "Yes. She prefers it to the front drive, easier access to the dower house." "And in this tempestuous weather, alone and on foot. How admirably intrepid. The path, I presume, passes beneath this very window." "It does," Sir Julian admitted. "Then it would have been theoretically possible," Whimsy said softly, "for someone to leave this house unseen, speak with Mrs. Hartley, or intercept her, and return through the garden door without troubling the front hall at all." His gaze drifted toward the untrustworthy latch. "Particularly if certain persons desired to conceal their movements from observant butlers and devoted companions." Sir Julian's hands tightened convulsively on the edge of the table. "Eleanor had nothing to do with this." "Let us hope not," murmured Whimsy, "for your sake as well as hers. But until the storm relents, we must work with what evidence we have within these walls." He glanced once more at the clock, its polished face reflecting the candlelight. "Time, it appears, has been tampered with this evening. I propose we set it right, both mechanically and morally." "One grows almost sentimental," remarked Whimsy, "when contemplating a really well-organized crime. It suggests that human nature, while deplorable, is at least industrious. Let us, however, descend from the general to the particular. We have fragments enough. What we lack is sequence. Bunter, we shall reconstruct the evening with all the pedantic accuracy of a railway timetable." He drew a chair slightly back from the table and seated himself so that he could see all faces at once. The effect was faintly judicial. "We begin," he said, "at 5 o'clock. Dr. Thornhill arrives. Lady Whitcombe consults him about her headaches and incidentally her testamentary dispositions. She appears perfectly determined to effect certain changes which, if we are to believe him, would have produced consternation in several quarters. Thornhill inclined his head stiffly. That is correct. At 5:30, continued Whimsy, Sir Julian visits his wife in the morning room.
You see the doctor's bag, Sir Julian? On the side table, Julian admitted. Closed, I remember, because I nearly stumbled over it. Very good.
At 6 o'clock, Reeford, you are in the dining room. In and out, my lord, supervising the laying of the table. And at 6:30, Mrs. Hodges finds the window open and virtuously closes it again. William, you are finishing the glassware round about this time? Yes, my lord. I completed the settings just before Miss Penrose came in. Ah, yes, Miss Penrose and the peripatetic stopper. Whimsy smiled amiably at the companion. You drop it. William retrieves it. You replace it in the decanter with, I presume, the best intentions. I did nothing else, Lord Peter, she whispered. I barely touched the wretched thing. I am perfectly prepared to believe you touched it no more than was necessary. Excessive familiarity with murder weapons is so very incriminating. He tapped a long finger against the table. Shortly before 7, Sarah passes the morning room and finds the doctor's bag open. Bottles disturbed, no sign of the doctor. Where were you at that moment, Dr. Thornhill? In the library with Sir Julian, Thornhill answered promptly. We were discussing local charitable subscriptions. Sir Julian can confirm. Julian nodded, though rather vaguely. Yes, that is, I believe so. We were certainly together before dressing. And Lady Whitcombe? In her room, presumably, said Miss Penrose. She rang for me at 7:15. I was with her until 7 exactly. Excellent. See, Whimsy rose, his movements suddenly brisk. Bunter, we shall examine that medical bag. I have conceived a burning curiosity about its pharmacological contents. They left the others under the uneasy supervision of Reverend Blackwood and made their way to the morning room. The storm had subsided to a steady drumming against the windows, like insistent fingers. The bag sat on the side table where Sarah had described it, the catches fastened but not, as Bunter discovered, fully engaged. A hasty closing, Whimsy remarked. The conscience, like the hands, sometimes betrays itself in small omissions. Bunter laid out the contents with the reverence of a sacristan preparing sacred vessels. Hypodermic syringes, small phials of digitalis, morphine ampoules, sal volatile, and one space conspicuously empty in the fitted rack. There is an outline where a bottle has rested, my lord, recently removed. Label, a narrow one judging by the dust pattern. Similar in size to these, amyl nitrite, atropine, and potassium cyanide. Potassium cyanide, repeated Whimsy softly. One of the more cooperative poisons, easily transformed to prussic acid with a little knowledge and less conscience. And our missing bottle. Thornhill, summoned from the dining room with reluctant dignity, stared at the gap. It was there this afternoon, he said hoarsely. I use it for laboratory preparations only.
I never Quite, said Whimsy. You merely provided the orchestra. Someone else chose the tune. He closed the bag gently.
We may take it then that prussic acid was available to any person with the nerve to open this bag uninvited. They returned to the dining room. The company looked up with the collective guilt of school children caught in unauthorized conversation. Well, demanded Captain Marston. Merely that our poison has fled its lawful home, replied Whimsy. The cyanide bottle is missing. Since it is unlikely to have grown legs and eloped with a passing mouse, we must conclude that one of you borrowed it for purposes other than chemistry. He moved to the suspect window again, drawing back the curtain. The rain had lessened to a thin, silvery veil. Beyond the rose garden, faintly discernible in the intermittent lightning, lay the low, dark outline of the dower house. Sir Julian, he said pleasantly, I believe a brief visit to Mrs. Hartley is now indicated. One should never ignore a potential widow in a murder case. They have such a disconcerting habit of knowing things. Bunter, fetch my coat. We shall take the rose garden path. It appears to have been used already this evening, and I am always loath to disappoint a path once it has committed itself to intrigue. The procession to the gun-room resembled nothing so much as a particularly morbid house-party game. Follow my leader to the scene of your own disgrace. The storm howled down the corridor like an outraged banshee, rattling the casement panes and sending faint draughts through the ancient plaster. Candles flared and guttered in their sconces, throwing the party's shadows monstrously large upon the walls. The gunroom itself was a masculine sanctuary of the conventional type, panelling darkened by pipe smoke, racks of well-kept guns, leather chairs with the characteristic sag that speaks of generations of male relaxation and occasional domestic exile. A faint odour of oil, tobacco and damp tweed hung in the air, overlaid now with the sharper tang of fresh solvent. Whimsy paused just inside the threshold, sniffing delicately. Ballistal and linseed, eminently respectable, he remarked, and yet beneath it a faint, more acrid note. Bunter? His manservant had already drifted past, eyes moving over the room with quiet method. He stooped by the gun-cleaning bench. "This cloth, my lord, recently used." Whimsy took it between thumb and forefinger. A dark smear stained the rag. Oil, yes, but mottled by a crystalline residue that glittered faintly in the lamplight. He sniffed very cautiously. "How unimaginative," he murmured. "One almost hoped for something original." Dr. Thornhill frowned. "What are you implying?" "Merely that our murderer is a practical soul. Potassium cyanide crystals dissolve slowly in oil but adhere quite prettily to rough cloth. A convenient way to transport a small quantity from your medical bag to the dining room without carrying a suspicious bottle about one's person." He held the rag out. Note, too, the faint almond reek, suppressed but not entirely absent. Captain Marston gave an incredulous laugh that ended much too abruptly. "You can't seriously think anyone used my cleaning rags to—" "On the contrary, Captain, I am certain of it." Whimsy's gaze swept the room. "Observe, the bench is situated directly beneath the window leading to the terrace. The latch bears traces of the same oil smudge Bunter found in the dining room. From here one may step out, pass along the terrace, reach the rose garden window and gain access to the dining room without traversing the main passages at all." Sir Julian's voice emerged strained. "But who would know that route?" "Anyone who has spent an idle hour avoiding Lady Whitcomb's less agreeable social occasions," said Whimsy dryly. "Which I imagine includes most of you." He crossed to the gun rack, his fingers running lightly along the polished stocks. "Curious, one space empty. Your service revolver, Captain." "In my room," Marston replied too quickly. "I told you I was cleaning it, then took it up with me to dress. I must have forgotten to put it back." Bunter, who had glided to the door, returned with characteristic unobtrusiveness. "The revolver is not in Captain Marston's room, my lord." The silence that followed was of the thick, suffocating variety. Marston's jaw clenched. "Then someone has moved it. I left it on my dressing table." "You can't possibly suggest—" "I suggest nothing," said Whimsy, examining a faint trail of dried mud on the floorboards near the terrace door. "I merely observe that the person who carried that rag to the dining room was considerate enough to wipe their boots imperfectly when they returned. Note the pattern, Bunter. Clay from the lower garden path, I think, rather than the gravel drive." Bunter bent, nodded once. "From the rose garden, my lord. The soil is heavier there." Miss Penrose, who had followed hesitantly, spoke in a strained whisper. "I don't understand. If someone went out this way and into the dining room by the window, why meddle with the clock as well?" "Because," replied Whimsy, "Lady Whitcombe was a tyrant of punctuality. Dinner at 7:30 to the minute. Any unexplained absence from 6 to 7 would have required elaborate justification. But if one advanced the clock, one could compress or stretch the apparent interval at will. A neat little distortion of time to accommodate a brief excursion with poison and rag." He turned to Sir Julian. "Tell me, who wound the clock today?" Thornhill answered reluctantly. "I did, as usual, at 4 o'clock." "And afterward?" "I didn't touch it again." Yet when I arrived at 7, it declared 8:15. Someone tampered with it between 4 and 7 to create a false impression of lateness. An impression which, once created, could be conveniently cited later. No, surely it was nearly 8 when I... and so forth. The Reverend Blackwood, who had hitherto maintained a sort of pained neutrality, cleared his throat. "Are you implying that one of us deliberately altered the time to conceal a visit to this room?" "I am implying," said Whimsy with dangerous mildness, "that the murder of Lady Whitcombe required not only chemical knowledge and household familiarity, but also a certain talent for stage management. We are dealing not with a sudden impulse, but with an elaborate production, props, timing, entrances, exits." He let his gaze rest very deliberately upon each face in turn. "And every production, however ingeniously contrived, leaves behind its discarded scenery. Our murderer has been most industrious in clearing away the obvious traces. Unfortunately for him, or her, the small, stupid details remain: the mislaid revolver, the chilled champagne, the window that would not quite stay shut." A sudden violent gust rattled the terrace door, setting it shuddering in its frame. Somewhere in the depths of the house the clock struck 10, the chimes hollow and echoing. Whimsy smiled faintly. "I think," he said, "that we are very nearly ready for our final act. But before the curtain rises, there is one more player we must consult. The lady in the dower house who inspires such inconvenient devotion. For if this evening has been a carefully written drama, we have not yet heard from the woman for whom Sir Julian would sacrifice anything, and for whom Lady Whitcombe would sacrifice no opportunity of cruelty." He turned toward the door. "Bunter, procure umbrellas and lanterns. We shall pay a call on Mrs. Eleanor Hartley. Murder, like love, seldom confines itself to the main house. Lady Whitcombe's boudoir, when they reached it, had that particular air of cultivated intimacy which suggests not so much a room as a stage set for a personality. The lamps, turned low, cast a roseate light over satin and ormolu. Perfume lingered in the air with cloying insistence, fighting a losing battle against the damp chill creeping in from the storm. The dead woman's presence seemed to saturate the place more thoroughly than any scent. "Observe," remarked Whimsy, pausing on the threshold, "the authentic lair of a domestic deity. One almost expects the entrails of sacrificial victims scattered on the hearthrug. As it is, we must content ourselves with correspondence and account books, which are nearly as revealing and rather easier to catalogue." Bunter moved silently to the writing table, already equipped with blotter, sandshaker, and the inevitable locked drawers. Whimsy tested one with a cautious hand. "Bunter, I fancy your persuasive talents will be required." The requisite instruments appeared from Bunter's pocket with the inevitability of fate. A moment's delicate manipulation produced a satisfying click, and the top drawer slid open with the resigned air of furniture long accustomed to yielding up secrets. Inside lay a regimented array of labelled packets and envelopes, each bearing names written in Lady Whitcombe's angular hand. Whimsy's eye travelled over them with professional appreciation. Penrose, Thornhill, Blackwood, Marston, Hartley. Ah, she was an equal opportunity tormentor. How very commendable. Let us begin with something comparatively mild. Miss Penrose, will you indulge my curiosity? Miss Penrose, pale and rigid by the doorway, made a faint sound that might have been assent. Whimsy opened the packet bearing her name and extracted a sheaf of letters, some in a neat, feminine script, others in a more hesitant, male hand. "Correspondence from your brother Arthur," he observed, detailing not merely unfortunate investments, but the small matter of forged signatures and misappropriated trust funds. Lady Whitcombe appears to have paid quite handsomely to hush it up. Miss Penrose's hands flew to her mouth. "She promised. She said it would never be spoken of." "Spoken of? No. Weaponized, certainly." Whimsy replaced the papers with fastidious care. "But forgery, though distasteful, lacks the pungent flavour required for murder. Let us try another." The Thornhill packet produced a thin bundle of medical reports and a typewritten statement bearing the heading of a London hospital. Whimsy skimmed it rapidly, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly. "Ah, yes, the overdose case. The patient was your former fiancé, Doctor. Your evidence at the inquest was economical with the truth. Lady Whitcombe possessed the original nursing notes contradicting your testimony. A career-ending document, I imagine." Thornhill's lips had compressed into a bloodless line. She swore those papers had been destroyed. Lady Whitcombe appears to have been less scrupulous about destruction than about storage. Whimsy's hand moved unhurriedly to the Reverend's file. "And for our shepherd of souls?" The letters within were, as Blackwood had admitted, dangerously ambiguous, earnest protests of spiritual regard phrased with an intimacy that would have delighted parish gossips and dismayed episcopal authorities. Attached, however, was something more substantial, a memorandum in Lady Whitcomb's hand, calculating the exact sum diverted from the Restoration Fund. "Embezzlement with devotional trimmings," Whimsy murmured. "Quite picturesque, but still not the central drama. No, I fancy our main act lies here." His finger paused over the packet marked Hartley. Sir Julian made a choking sound, but Whimsy had already drawn out the contents: a photograph, a birth certificate, and a legal document bearing an unfamiliar name. The photograph showed Eleanor Hartley younger by some 15 years, holding a dark-haired child whose features bore an uncomfortable resemblance to Sir Julian's. The birth certificate named the boy as Thomas, Julian Hartley, mother Eleanor Hartley, father unknown. The legal document, dated the previous month, was more explicit, a sworn statement from a retired solicitor, testifying that the child had, in fact, been conceived during an improper intimacy between Eleanor and Sir Julian, while Lady Whitcombe was still in her first year of marriage. Sir Julian staggered as though struck.
She can't have. Tom died at 6. Scarlet fever. Eleanor was destroyed by it."
"And your wife," said Whimsy gently, "was destroyed by the knowledge that the only child she might have had in her house, the only possible heir, was not hers but the product of your adultery. This document, if made public, would have rendered your position untenable, socially, morally, and perhaps legally." He laid the papers down with infinite care. Yet even this is not quite the key, for attached, observe, is a second statement, from a woman named Martha Jevons, formerly nursery maid at the Dower House. He unfolded it, scanning the lines with quick, precise attention. His eyes sharpened. "Ah," he breathed very softly. "So that is it. That explains the window, the clock, the peculiar partnership in our little tragedy." He looked up, his gaze passing over Sir Julian, over Dr. Thornhill, and coming to rest, with a curious gentleness, on Miss Penrose. "I think," he said, "that we have at last reached the heart of Lady Whitcomb's secret, and of her murder. The rest must be played out downstairs. This, I fancy, is a drama that demands a proper stage." "The final settlement," repeated Whimsy, his voice carrying the quiet authority of an executioner reading the death warrant.
£10,000 paid on the very day of her death.
A curious sum for a husband to pay his wife, unless it represented the purchase price of something exceptionally valuable or exceptionally dangerous. Sir Julian had collapsed into the leather armchair opposite the desk, his earlier composure disintegrating into the raw vulnerability of a man who has played his last card and
Lost. "It wasn't just money," he whispered, his hands trembling as he gripped the armrests. "It was my life, my reputation, everything."
"The embezzlement was merely the symptom, not the disease," Whimsy continued, pacing slowly before the fireplace where the dying embers cast long, distorted shadows. "You were paying blackmail not to your wife, but through her. Lady Whitcombe wasn't the extortionist in this particular instance. She was the intermediary." The silence that followed was absolute. Miss Penrose had ceased her weeping and was staring at Sir Julian with dawning horror. Captain Marston stood frozen near the door, while Dr. Thornhill looked as though he wished profoundly to be anywhere else on earth. "The Dower House," said Whimsy softly. "Eleanor Hartley, you told us earlier that your wife knew of your affection for her cousin and found it amusing, but the truth was rather more sordid, wasn't it, Mrs. Hartley wasn't merely the object of your affection, she was the architect of your ruin." Sir Julian covered his face with his hands. "Eleanor had letters, documents from my time in India, indiscretions that would have destroyed my career and my standing in the county. She demanded money, endless streams of money, and when my own funds ran dry, I began taking from the estate accounts. My wife discovered the embezzlement 6 months ago, and with characteristic ruthlessness, Whimsy deduced, Lady Whitcombe decided to turn your weakness into her strength. She agreed to facilitate the payments to Mrs. Hartley, ensuring your continued dependence and her absolute control over the family fortune. But today, something changed. She told me this morning that she was finished." Sir Julian's voice was barely audible. "She had gathered enough evidence to expose Eleanor for extortion and send her to prison. She intended to reveal everything tonight. My embezzlement, Eleanor's blackmail, the whole sordid mess. She called it cleaning house. And so," said Whimsy, turning back to the room with sudden energy, "we have the final piece of our psychological puzzle. Lady Whitcombe's murder was not a single conspiracy, but a collision of desperate intentions. Captain Marston prepared the weapon to save his inheritance. Miss Penrose delivered the poison to protect her brother's secret and end her own torment. But there was a third hand at work, someone who ensured that the stage was perfectly set for tragedy." He moved to the window, peering out into the storm-lashed darkness toward the distant lights of the Dower House. The open window in the dining room, the muddy footprints near the terrace door, the voices heard in the passage. Someone came from outside tonight, someone who knew the house intimately and had the most to lose from Lady Whitcombe's revelations. "Eleanor?" breathed Sir Julian. "Mrs. Hartley had every reason to ensure Lady Whitcombe never made her announcement. She knew the layout of the house, knew about the gun-room entrance, and most importantly, she knew about the champagne." Whimsy turned back to face them, his expression grim. Because who else would have suggested to Lady Whitcombe that the Pole Roger 98 required such extreme chilling? Who else would have planted the idea that made the poison effective? "She visited yesterday," Miss Penrose whispered. "She spent an hour with Lady Whitcombe in the morning room. They were discussing the dinner arrangements, and doubtless suggesting that the vintage champagne be served at a temperature that would conveniently mask the scent of bitter almonds." Whimsy's voice hardened. "We have a murderer of execution, Miss Penrose, driven by decades of humiliation. We have a murderer of intent, Captain Marston, motivated by greed. But behind them both stands the murderer of design, the person who orchestrated the conditions, manipulated the players, and waited in the shadows to ensure the performance reached its fatal conclusion." "But if Eleanor was involved," Dr. Thornhill interjected, "where is she now? The storm would have made travel impossible." "Precisely," said Whimsy, moving toward the door with purposeful strides. "Which suggests that our unseen director is still on the premises, doubtless waiting in the one place where she could observe the results of her handiwork without being seen. Bunter, I believe a visit to the gallery overlooking the dining hall is in order. I suspect we shall find Mrs. Massey. Hartley has been attending our little drama from the best seat in the house." As they moved into the corridor, the storm seemed to redouble its fury, shaking the very foundations of Whitcombe Hall. But inside, the atmosphere was even more volatile, charged with the electricity of imminent revelation and the terrible weight of truths that had been buried too long in the dark soil of family secrets. Inspector Grieve, heavy, practical, and faintly damp about the edges, took in the scene with the weary resignation of a man to whom human depravity came as no particular surprise, only as an inconvenience to existing paperwork. "So she's dead right enough," he said, after a cursory inspection of Lady Whitcombe's shrouded form back in the dining room. "And there's poison in it, you say, my lord?" "My dear Grieve," replied Whimsy, toying with the stopper now safely sealed in one of Bunter's glass tubes, "there is so much poison in this house at present that one hardly knows where to begin. Chemical, moral, and social, all in charming confusion. But yes, prussic acid administered by means of a prepared crystal stopper, cooled champagne, and a butler's impeccable technique." Grieve sniffed the air suspiciously, as though expecting cyanide to leap for his throat. "You'll oblige me, then, with the particulars, plain ones, if you please. I haven't your taste for Latin tags and conjuring tricks." Whimsy, seated once more at the long table, obliged. He laid out the elements in that flat, almost bored tone he adopted when his mind had finished its work and was now merely engaged in housekeeping. "The technical preparation," he began, "was Captain Marston's contribution. Using his gun-room resources, he filed and acid-etched the stopper to retain a poisonous paste. He meant to poison Lady Whitcombe himself, but at the last moment his nerve failed, and he left the prepared stopper in the gun-room. Marston, pale and exhausted, made no attempt to deny it." Grieve regarded him with professional disfavour. "Miss Penrose," continued Whimsy, "supplied the active ingredient, potassium cyanide, stolen from Dr. Thornhill's bag while the doctor and Sir Julian discussed the new will. She discovered Marston's preparations, realized what he intended, and saw in them the means to her own deliverance. She fetched the stopper from the gun-room, mixed the cyanide into a paste, and made the substitution when she adjusted the place cards. Miss Penrose, who had finished her written confession under Bunter's impassive supervision, stared at the tablecloth with the stunned vacancy of one who has discovered that the gallows is not a metaphor. "And Sir Julian?" asked Grieve. "You're not suggesting he handled the poison as well?" "No," said Whimsy. "Sir Julian contributed omission rather than commission. He observed Marston's work in the gun-room, knew what Miss Penrose had done with the stopper, and did precisely nothing to prevent either. On the contrary, he tampered with the clock to muddle the timeline and remained delicately blind to the reopened window. His wife's threatened revelation about his illegitimate son made her continued existence intolerable. He simply allowed the disaster to proceed." Grieve scratched his head. "I've known more straightforward shootings," he admitted, "but if they'll all sign what they've said in front of witnesses, I dare say the Crown will know what to make of it." "Quite so," murmured Whimsy. "I leave the exact degrees of moral turpitude to prosecuting counsel and the Almighty. Between them they generally contrive something plausible." It was nearly 8 in the morning when Whimsy and Bunter at last stood in the drive, watching as the prisoners were conveyed away in separate vehicles, Whitcombe Hall staring after them with the blank, reproachful gaze of a decayed grande dame who has lived to see her own scandal in the morning papers. The storm had blown itself out, leaving the lawns strewn with torn leaves and branches. The air smelled of wet earth and extinguished violence. Sir Julian, not yet formally arrested but clearly no longer master of his own future, stood at the front steps like a man who has misplaced not merely his hat, but his entire identity. "What will become of the boy?" he asked suddenly, as Whimsy prepared to step into the car. "Thomas! Oh, the boy!" Whimsy's tone was almost brisk. "He will, with luck, grow up without the benefit of too much money or too many relations, a salutary condition. Mrs. Hartley appears to possess more sense than the rest of your family combined. If she is left unmolested, the child may even turn into something useful. And the estate?" "That," said Whimsy, "will no doubt occupy a small army of solicitors for several years, thus providing honest employment for the professional classes. Be comforted, Sir Julian. Very few great houses die of murder. They die of dry rot and death duties. Your particular contribution will be a mere footnote." As the car moved down the long gravelled drive, Bunter observed respectfully, "A distressing affair, my lord." "Extremely, Bunter. In the anonymity stakes, a well-run blackmail operation is vastly superior to a murder trial. Lady Whitcombe should have stuck to her original line of business." "Very good, my lord." Whimsy lit a cigarette. watching the smoke curl against the washed-out sky. The trouble with the modern upper classes, Bunter, is that they have lost the knack of sinning with style. Blackmail, adultery, illegitimate heirs, perfectly workable institutions when properly managed. But once people begin mixing prussic acid with domestic grievances, the whole thing becomes depressingly suburban. Yes, my lord. He leaned back as the hall disappeared behind a curve of the drive. Still, there is some consolation. Lady Whitcombe wanted to prove that secrets have consequences. One must admit she was as good as her word. The journey back to London possessed that peculiar flatness which follows the resolution of a complex puzzle, like the silence that descends after the last bar of a symphony, when all that remains is the memory of sound. The countryside, washed clean by the night's tempest, unfolded in damp greys and reluctant greens, while the Bentley purred along with the discretion of a well-trained confessor. Bunter, at the wheel, maintained his usual tactful silence until they had cleared the worst of the country lanes. Then, with the discretion of a man polishing a particularly delicate piece of silver, he ventured, "If I might make so bold, my lord, the Whitcombe matter appears to have been more, shall I say, crowded than is commonly the case." "Crowded is the word," agreed Whimsy, lighting a cigarette with more care than seemed strictly necessary. "Most murders are solo performances, one actor, one impulse, one fatal act. This one resembled a badly cast amateur dramatics production in which everyone insisted on having a speaking part." Bunter allowed himself the faintest suggestion of amusement. "You do not consider, my lord, that justice has been perhaps oversupplied?" "Undersupplied, if anything." Whimsy exhaled a plume of smoke toward the windscreen. "Lady Whitcombe has contrived to occupy the position of both victim and principal architect. She arranged the stage, accumulated the motives, and then stood squarely in the line of fire with a quite un-English disregard for personal safety." "Suicidal, my lord?" "Not consciously. She believed in her own invulnerability, an occupational hazard among blackmailers and minor deities. She thought she could continue to pull strings indefinitely without ever considering that puppets occasionally pick up knives. The hedgerows unwound themselves in an orderly fashion as Bunter considered this. "You do not anticipate, then, that any of the defendants may escape conviction?" "One of them will almost certainly hang," said Whimsy, with the grim detachment of a man reading stock prices. "The law dislikes complexity. It tends to fasten upon the clearest mechanical act. Miss Penrose actually applied the poison. Her confession, combined with the forensic evidence, will make her the Crown's favourite exhibit. And Captain Marston, my lord, will probably find himself the beneficiary of that modern superstition known as mitigating circumstances. Our war record, emotional disturbance, financial desperation, add a competent counsel and he may escape the rope in favour of a prolonged acquaintance with prison porridge. And Sir Julian? Ah." Whimsy watched a clump of bare trees slide past, their branches black against the washed-out sky. "Sir Julian will suffer the most and quite possibly serve the least. The law is ill-equipped to punish sins of omission. He will be charged, naturally. The Crown hates to waste so excellent a scandal, but his guilt lies chiefly in what he did not do. Juries are sentimental about weakness, particularly when decently dressed." "And the boy, my lord?" "Thomas." Whimsy's voice softened almost imperceptibly. "He will grow up, I trust, without knowing precisely how much ruin accompanied his existence. If there is any justice in the celestial accounting department, the sins of the father may for once be allowed to fall short of the third and fourth generation." They drove in companionable silence for several miles. At last Bunter said, "You are not entirely satisfied, if I may say so, my lord." "My dear Bunter, satisfaction is for theologians and second-rate novelists. I merely have the faint sensation of having accepted a provisional answer in place of a complete one. There is no solution here that does not leave an unpleasant taste, rather like drinking excellent claret out of a chipped mug." He flicked ash neatly into the tray. "What did we achieve? We prevented nobody's death, restored nobody's fortune, and destroyed the lives of 3 moderately inadequate human beings who might, under different circumstances, have muddled along harmlessly enough. The only unequivocal improvement is the removal of Lady Whitcombe, and we accomplished that most inefficiently after the fact. If I might suggest, my lord, said Bunter tactfully, you did at least prevent further crimes. Possibly, or merely cut short a particularly unedifying serial. Whimsy shrugged. Still, we have demonstrated once again that murder is the least economical method of solving domestic difficulties. A good solicitor and an honest confession would have been vastly cheaper all round. The London skyline began to assemble itself on the horizon, grey and comforting. Whimsy straightened his tie with unnecessary precision. Take us to the club, Bunter. After a night spent in the company of blackmail, adultery and compound homicide, I feel the need for something truly corrupt and disreputable, such as the Diogenes attempt at BTT.
Coffee. Very good, my lord.
As the Bentley slid into the ordered geometry of London streets, Whimsy reflected, not for the first time, that while truth might set one free in the spiritual sense, in the temporal jurisdiction, it had an unfortunate habit of leading directly to the dock. He sighed, quoted half under his breath, "Quis desiderio sit pudor aut, modus," and allowed the city to close over Whitcombe Hall and its unhappy ghosts like a curtain falling on a play whose actors had all forgotten their lines.